So for a startup I've been working on, we needed to capture screenshots. And so that's kind of where I started to mess with PhantomJS. And originally where I heard about it was somebody works on an enterprise analytics package, and they needed to make sure that IE would actually like render D3JS charts and things like that. And you can't actually, I mean, D3JS works with SVG and I think Canvas, right? Is that right? But you couldn't actually render that, and IE6 was the problem. So he said, well, you know, I use this thing called PhantomJS to be able to render it. And I was like, well, I need to do screenshots. So that's how I first heard about it. Let me run through my presentation here. So PhantomJS, or what I kind of think of this presentation as PhantomJS and Node.js and how that saved my bacon in this project. So I had to take 500,000 screenshots of web pages. It was basically 500 sites and 1,000 pages each one. And the reason why I needed it was because I needed actual like thumbnails inside of my UI that would show for our user interface, like little pictures of pages going across the bottom. And we also needed to have a historical archive of a web page as it appeared on a certain day. When I was running this, it took about 3 weeks, and I was running between like 4 and 8 like EC2 instances, and it was about $350 for us to actually run through all that. And the problem that I ran into was that I had like 2 calendar weeks before the end of the month, and I had to finish it before the end of the month. So I was like, okay, well, what am I going to do? I guess it's time to like actually use PhantomJS. So I spent about 2 days rewriting our screenshots, and I ran the thing in about 4 days, and at the end of it, we were doing about 260,000 screenshots per day. And when I finally calculated the cost of the EC2 instances, it was about $63 per day with 5 EC2 instances. One was kind of our master database server, and the other 4 were actually just PhantomJS slaves. Yeah, Dave?
Quick question. What size instances are you using?
I think they were large. They were large instances because I think they had 4 gigs of memory, and they had 2 cores each. And I was running PhantomJS with 2 Phantom processes per whatever, per instance. And so that's what I was doing. So what is PhantomJS? It's actually a headless web browser with a JavaScript API, meaning that you have a headless web browser is a web browser that doesn't have a user interface. And the way that you actually are able to call into pages is through a JavaScript API. It's built on WebKit. It runs on Mac, Windows, and Linux. It's open source. It has constant updates, and you can fork it off of GitHub. This is what the web page looks like for it. You can see that kind of like the best things to use with it are headless website testing, screen capture, page automation, DOM manipulation, and network performance testing, like if you want to run through your site with Wi-Fi or something like that. So, as I mentioned before, the rendered SVG to a PNG is a great use case for Phantom. DOM parsing and manipulation is another good thing to do. And I'm going to try to show what the API for PhantomJS looks like. You can also just start up the command processor as well, and you can run in a REPL loop where you have like you just type in JavaScript commands and it will run interactively. And the API for JavaScript actually uses the module pattern, so if you've seen Require.js, you'll be familiar with how it works. So this is kind of a simple example of just taking a screenshot comes from the PhantomJS web page. You can see here's the module that it's pulling in for web pages. And it's loading the page here. And then once it's done, it's just exiting out. So it's a very simple JavaScript API. And if I added just a little bit more code here, I could actually just say page.render, and it will save it to a screenshot as well. So a more advanced way, and how I ended up using it, was using something called Screenshot as a Service. This was an Express Node.js project that forked a version of TJ Holochek's, I think is his name, project. And what it would actually do is run an Express web server that would call into PhantomJS, and it would render web pages that I would give it. So in this example here, if I pass over like a URL, google.com, it will save a screenshot for google.com. In this example, it'll do the same thing, but it'll just make it 800 by 600 inside the PNG. And in this last one, and I think this is the coolest example, it actually has a callback URL. So I call this web service, and at some point it finishes, and it calls back to my web service and says, here's your requested PNG file, and I can say it to this. So what I thought was kind of neat about this was that PhantomJS is running as a web server, and also the screenshot as a service was running as a web server as well using Express. So it's kind of an interesting thing where I would be calling into 3000, port 3000 for Express, and having it called into, I think it was like 3015 for PhantomJS, and PhantomJS would then process it. So let me pull up a little bit of that code so you kind of see how that's working. So this is where the app.js is, which starts up Express. So you can see that they have what they call a rasterizer service, which is what takes a page and turns it into a PNG file. And it also had a file cleaner service, which would go through and clean up anything that wasn't that was in the temporary directory. After like 10 minutes or something like that, it would just go through and clean out all the screenshots. So if you look at it, it's pretty much just the standard Express startup, right? Nothing too unusual. You have some routes and whatnot. There's a public. Every once in a while, what it will do is call into a health check to make sure that this PhantomJS service is still running. And what it does is it spawns a child process here, which is being run by PhantomJS. This is the PhantomJS script for that. And you can see that it has a route on PhantomJS to look for the health check that falls into it, just to make sure the process hasn't died or become too overloaded by processes. You can see this is where it actually does clipping. So it's taking a large image and making it into like 800 by 600, for instance. So here's that little bit of screenshot. It's doing a page shot render, which just saves out the PNG file. And this is just going into a log file, response.write. Page release, just cleaning up garbage. Response.close is actually just pushing out the PNG on HTTP and then closing the socket connection after. And so that's kind of like the basics of what a more advanced version of what you would do with PhantomJS. And actually, you know, if you start up Phantom, you can actually just do some really simple things. See, this is the REPL loop. And if you actually want to start up something, you give it like the JavaScript file to run, any parameters, something like that. I wish I had a good example, but I just don't have a good example right now. So let me go through the next set of slides. So another thing that Phantom is really good for is actually parsing. So if you know anything about Node, there's JS DOM, which emulates a DOM inside of Node, but it's fake. It's not real, right? So you're running a fake version of a web browser in a DOM, and you're trying to parse inside of that, but it doesn't have JavaScript. So it's good in a way because you're able to run this inside of Node, but it's not a true web browser. So what would be better is if you actually were running your actual pages inside of PhantomJS where you actually have JavaScript, you have a real DOM, and you can actually just go through and use jQuery to go through and parse things. So that's like a really easy way to, like say, go to a page, grab something out of a DOM element, and parse it. So it'd be really simple to do that. And if you're using Node, you can use npm to install Node.js, or PhantomJS, sorry. Casper.js is kind of like a Batman utility belt for Phantom. It does just like a ton of utility libraries because Phantom doesn't have a lot to it. It's very plain, but it does what it does really well. And so Casper And the joke, of course, is like, Casper's a friendly host, right? And Phantom is PhantomJS, right? So that's where the kind of inside joke is. And if you look at the home page, you can see that you can do navigation steps between pages, you can fill and submit forms, you can click and follow links, you can capture screenshots, you can do testing and remote DOM manipulation. You can download files using Casper.js. So it's a really powerful scripting library that sits on top of PhantomJS to do things like scraping web contents, or even testing. If you need to do unit testing or functional testing. So this is kind of an example of what Casper.js looks like. This is just pulling in your modules inside of JavaScript, a little bit of error checking to make sure that you actually specify a target. And here what we're doing is we're going to the Google Translate service, and we're filling in a form. Oops, didn't work too well. We're filling in a form here with the text that we enter from our web service, and we're fetching the results out of the result box. So we're calling into Google Translate. There isn't a good API, but we're using the power of PhantomJS and Casper.js to scrape these contents out of Google Translate. So that's kind of my examples of what I've used this for. The other thing that I really haven't mentioned too much is that a lot of people use PhantomJS for testing, headless website testing. A lot of people put this inside of their continuous integration builds to run different things. Let me pull up the Phantom.
I got a question.
Sure.
When it comes to the testing and stuff like that,
Yeah.
have you had a chance to do that yet?
I haven't.
Do you know, because you said it's a headless browser, and there's no actual input, you know, if there's any good, I don't, probably Phantom doesn't do it, but Casper does, like mouse pointer integration, where you can actually test.
Like actually click on things?
Well, hovering and like seeing if things appear in that sense. You can for unit testing.
Clicking for sure. Hovering, I'm not sure about.
Yeah,
but
you can worry about that, you can fire those yourself.
Yeah, you can do it that way, but I know that there is a way to actually click on links. I don't know if there's a way to do a hover because you actually have to emulate the mouse. You kind of see that like Bootstrap uses it as part of the continuous integration, CodeMirror, EmberJS, LessJS, YUI. You can use the testing with QUnit, Mocha, Capybara, WebDriver. Use it, right, Gabe? Is one of your, yeah. Which one, Capybara?
Capybara.
Yeah. So, I know it's a little bit like high level, but it's kind of a deep top, or not really high level. It's a very low level topic, but it's kind of, there isn't a good way to talk about PhantomJS without like actually digging into the code for this. So, any questions? No?
What's your final cost of Phantom?
I think like $300, but at the very end, at the very end of it, I got it up to 260,000 like sites per day or something like that. But like in the beginning, I wasn't like anywhere near that, so I'd spawn up more instances and try to optimize it. So like the next time I run it, it's going to cost $120. Yeah, sure.
When you're scraping the translate, Google Translate, I'm trying that, but I just get I don't get the translated language, I get the page.
So how are you doing it now? Are you calling into like, are you doing like HTTP calls into it? Like how are you doing it now? Well, I'll tell you what, like the code that's here, it basically does it for you. So just take a look at the example code. This one's called, I think it's like translate.
Yeah, use Carroll to bring in the page.
Yeah, so Carroll's kind of like, it's a headless web browser, but it doesn't actually have JavaScript, right?
Right.
So
I'm trying to use Java to parse it.
Right, and you can call in like directly like calling in on an HTTP connection, scraping contents and things like that. But if you can't run JavaScript, you know, some websites won't work with that.
I'm not sure what you guys call it, but I'll put it in my own page and then hash that page out later. You know what I mean? I make my own buffer and I put all the information on one page.
Yeah.
I take JavaScript and work on it with that.
The advantage to Casper.js is that it actually looks like a web browser and it looks like a person doing it as opposed to something that's mechanical. So take a look at this example. It's perfect for what you're looking for. Cool. Thanks, guys.